nobody's born for war. So I feel there's another kind of sarcastic joke in Ukraine that when some person called it, well, my husband is a deeply civilian person. Well, I feel a deeply civilian person still.
What's your revelation after you've been writing the war and comparing what you read about the war through the classics?
When I now reread Hemingway, The Farewell to Arms, so what I see is the story of a foreigner who came to fight on the side of Italians, and then he just deserted.
You could have been a James Bond because you started your education at Secret Service Academy.
At the time, I had a lot of questions about the world and myself. Like, is life as bad as it seems from within the military academy, or is it just me?
You might have other destiny.
Well, I don't believe in destiny so much because I think it's our choices that make us. The Iranian people are now absent. It's like they're becoming objects of politics. And for us in literature, in politics, and in our life, it's very important to remain not objects, but subjects of our own life. We have to fight off the Russian invasion, otherwise there will be no Ukraine, otherwise we will all either become refugees or worse, will be occupied and tortured. It's better to die dying than be tortured by the KGB or the Russian occupationist administration.
Do you think good Russian exist? And if they exist, where they are?
Ukrainian saying about all this Russian opposition that I don't want to get too much into different sorts of shit. I'm sorry about this word.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko, and you're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. Before the war, Artem Chapeye, he was one of the distinctive voices of Ukrainian modern literature. He was writing about travel, parenthood, everyday life, and Ukrainian identity. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, he joined armed forces. And for some time, he couldn't make himself writing, but he got back to writing. And now we can see his view, his reflections on the war in Ukraine and the challenges he's going through. Please welcome my guest today, Artem Chapeye. Artem, hello, how are you today?
I'm pretty good, thank you. I'm now at my working place. I work for the army. Now is we have very good weather and we haven't had a lot of bombings recently, so it's a pretty good day.
Artem, do you feel more like I actually was quite fascinated when I was looking at your biography, and you could have been a James Bond because you started your education at Secret Service Academy, and then political events and protest against one of the presidents, Leonid Kuchma. I don't. It's not clear. Was it because of that you left it, but you went totally different intellectual path? Did you ever regret that you left sort of probably the spy life or the life of the secret agent, and now
I haven't regretted it a single time in my life. So to be clear, that was a decision kind of forced upon me because in Ukraine we finished high school. At that time, we finished high school at 16 years old, and so I was a minor. Basically, the decision was made for me by my parents for financial reasons because they could not afford to support me as a student. And as soon as I turned 18, I planned to leave. And what triggered my decision were the protests against Ukrainian authoritarianism in 2001, where all of my friends were on one side and I was supposed to be kind of on the side of the regime. I was already 19 at the time, so I was ready to support myself. I was ready to leave and just work. I mean, I was already legally able to have a job. And so that made the decision easier, even though it was still kind of hard on my mom, basically. And since then, I switched to study I got my training in philosophy, which is kind of evident in all my writing. And the reason why I chose philosophy was because at the time I had a lot of questions about the world and myself. Like, is life as bad as it seems from within the military academy, or is it just me as a teenager? And that's how it went.
It's interesting because in one of your interviews, you were saying that I wish I'd live in non-historical times, somewhere far in the mountains, surrounded by nature, just writing books, reading books. And yet, your life absolutely reshaped by Ukrainian history. So the Secret Service Academy was one step, and then if we go further and look at the Ukraine's war, the full-scale invasion, a new person who were translating the literature against violence, against the war, against all of that, you taking the rifle and you leaving your sort of identity as a writer, risking life, separating from the family. Your family goes as a refugees to Germany, and you on sort of on the edge of history.
That's very true. We live in very historic times, and sometimes I do regret it. It is my fantasy to live as a, uh, as Asiya Shakur once said, I could have been so much more. I could have been a carpenter or a gardener or a teacher, but as she also says, and she's one of the founder of the Black Panthers, by the way. So she says that I'm forced into being a reluctant warrior because otherwise I would feel that I am subservient to evil. So this is something that went in my mind a lot. I heard it, by the way, in a song by a British band called Asian Dub Foundation, and it stayed with me since I was a teenager. So even though I would have wanted to be just a parent, a father of two kids, and a writer maybe, and nothing else, maybe my dream at that time was to just jog, go to the gym to lift some weights, and write and be with my kids. And that's it. That's what I would have wanted. But unfortunately, as we can see, we are all now living in pretty historic times, to put it mildly.
Do you think literature has chance to survive when there's always constant noise of artillery, missiles, Iranian shaheeds, and basically your everyday thoughts coming to just to survive the present rather than reflecting, thinking, and especially with your philosophical background?
I was told by an American writer that they expect that Ukraine may even become a hotbed or rather hothouse for literature, specifically for novels. And I feel like this is something that is happening. What I sometimes mm, not dislike, but well, I have ambiguous feeling about the fact that sometimes it's foreigners who write about Ukraine. Uh, Quoting against, like, I was very much influenced by Black Panthers also in my personal life. I was a friend with some, and I see this as a sort of cultural appropriation. Like, for example, one of Polish bestsellers in Europe now is about Ukrainian-Russian war, where a person was able to afford to just come, grab some knowledge, and leave and write. But I think this is something that happens a lot. Like, we have always seen, like, Joseph Conrad wrote about Africa. So this is a normal thing, but we're hoping for a Ukrainian literature about ourselves. And because for us, all of this story, the war generally, is about remaining agents. I was thinking right now we are talking as the Israeli US Iranian war is going on. And I was thinking a lot that we can, maybe I am mistaken, but what I see from the mass media, that the Iranian people are now absent. It's like they're becoming subjects. No, they're becoming objects of politics. And for us in literature, in politics, and in our life, it's very important to remain not objects, but subjects of our own life, to become the agents of our own life.
Well, I think Ukraine surprised everyone with that approach, isn't it? Because I I remember when the war started, and I was already living here, and it felt like everyone's just watching, and you can hear the time. It just depends on the country. There's like weeks, days, and there was shocking, while seeing and um, living through with your country getting destroyed and other more powerful and those who could make decision and influence, they didn't do anything, just watching reality TV. And I think that was the moment when Ukraine's like, we don't count on anybody, we do our best. And that was the biggest surprise. And maybe that was the reason why Ukraine appeared on this political map, because it was always the colony, wasn't it? And we sort of still internally and externally going through decolonization.
We are. But to be honest, we felt a lot of support actually, including active support. Even before the war started, like trying to prevent it, the US provided us with, I don't remember like how many, but airplanes of Javelin missiles. And as you remember, like in the first weeks, let's say, of the invasion, the Javelins, like in the public mind, became like a symbol of what we thought would soon devolve into a guerrilla. But luckily, as I'm writing in my book, because hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, like myself, writers, I don't know, construction workers, truck drivers, went and volunteered in the army, willing to fight and asking for weapons to defend ourselves and our land, our families, most of all. Like in my case, it was just the family, which I didn't want them to become refugees forever. And because hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians did this choice, I think is the reason why the the smaller army which already existed at the time had very high morale because they knew that there would be an influx, and Ukrainian army became like several times larger in numbers within weeks. So, but we must also recognize that international support in our case was, I would say, unprecedented. Some people are like, I always say that I'm left wing myself, and I was a little bit disappointed by some left wing people who said that, oh, because there's so much support, this should mean that Ukraine is fighting for somebody else's interest. No, I was fighting for the interest of my two kids and my wife, basically. This is how it usually happens. You can have like your conspiracy theories, but they will remain conspiracy theories. However, I must say thank you to everybody for the support, and we were especially supported, I would say, like by the Anglophone countries generally, and very much by Western and I would say rather Northern Europe mostly. Uh, not just Europe. I wanted to thank explicitly like one of the gestures, not military gestures, that I still remember from 2022. There was an Australian grandma. She called herself a grandma, Katie Perrett, who literally wrote to me because we were friends on Instagram and asked if she can knit sweaters for my two boys. And she did. And she sent them all the way from Australia to Germany, where they were refugees by the time she finished the sweaters. And these small gestures are what mattered a lot, especially in the first months. We felt like, I still feel like we are being supported unprecedented, at an unprecedented level. And it seems that for most people, except some, I don't know, conspiracy theorists, everything was so clear. Like there was no division similar to what we are seeing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. It was much clearer than with Iran, where the regime is bad, but I don't know, but it's not good to bomb and the people have disappeared. Here it was obvious. There's the agent, which is the Ukrainian people, not so much even the government, but the Ukrainian people that is fighting against a rather obvious evil, rather obvious. Like I'm sure we are not so good. There's a lot of questions for us, like about some, let's say, right wing fragments in the army, or let's say about corruption, yes. We're like people like, I think no less, but no more corrupt than, let's say, the United States. But the other side was so evidently evil, and the case was so clear that only people who are really into conspiracy theories, including sometimes, unfortunately, great minds, like Chomsky, who I argue with a lot since 2022, because I translated him into Ukrainian, and that was a personal matter for me. But for most people, it was very obvious, I would say.
Yeah, it's true. But interesting. Again, your biography. Usually, for many people who joined like you at the first days of a full-scale invasion, they closed their businesses, paused their careers, and just became soldiers. You did as well. And if I'm not mistaken, the first year or something, you couldn't make yourself write or anything. Your mind wasn't there. And then when you did, and you've been widely recognized, you've got publisher in France, and then you were listed in the US, and in British Amazon, I can order, if I'm not mistaken, 3 of your books translated into English. So it's amazing, isn't it? Because for many years, I remember the BBC when I was working in Kiev, and we had 2 literacy voices from Ukraine. It's Oksana Zabushka and Andriy Kurkov. And Andriy Kurkov, he was commenting everything. And now he's big advocate of Ukrainian authors, Ukrainian literature, and he reposted. And on this podcast we were discussing as well, because it's so important. There's kind of like the window of opportunity for Ukrainian intellectuals. What sort of you feel was a surprise for you being recognized and kind of like new swirl of your writer's career abroad?
I'm still talking about it with my psychotherapist. Because this is a very ambiguous feeling, and like deeply ambiguous. This is like a feeling that splits you in half. That on the one hand, well, in my case, I have become internationally renowned, and largely because of the war. On the other hand, the price of it has been too big. I have lost my best friend to the Russian bomb, to a Russian bomb. I have lost 2 years of family life. Like even now, like I have been rather traumatized. Like even now, I'm drinking. Like I'm going to the army, and I'm having like my son on the. I have 2
Yeah.
cups like this with 2 of my sons, and I just change them. Like I wash one, and then I bring the other one. And the price has been a lot big. The price has been hundreds of thousands, no, maybe like tens of thousands of lives and millions of disrupted lives. Let's put it that way. And personally as well, the price has been, well, long-term depression, which I'm still fighting. So this is a very ambiguous feeling, you know.
I um I can relate to them because before the full-scale invasion, I mainly worked as a freelancer for BBC and for their documentary program, and sort of and I having 3 4 contracts during the year, it gave me the balance of keeping the looking after a child, being mom, being wife, and also sort of like not leaving the profession, because when you emigrate, journalists usually it's quite luck to stay in the profession. But
And
then
I don't know, by the way, are you now in the UK or in
yeah,
Ukraine?
yeah, I noticed that you started being in the list of Ukrainian BBC book contest since 2011. And it's the year when I moved to London, because beforehand, Svetlana Pyrkalo,
Miracle.
she's the inspiration and she's the face of but she didn't live in Kiev. So I was the one who was sort of like doing the interviews with authors, meeting with them, and that was my favorite part of the job. And I noticed like that's why we didn't cross our paths. It's like I left and you sort of started, and then
Yeah, I was interviewed by Jean Bespetnichuk, your colleague. Yeah, she's now working in BBC in Ukraine. Yeah, so I remember I was interviewed by her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and it was I remember and so since the full-scale invasion, I worked for BBC a few days, and then ITV there, the main competitor in the UK, pulled, and I was like 24/7 there. On one hand, I just wanted to be useful to Ukraine before, and we had this hot discussions at home before my husband actually was okay for me going there with the crew. But it was just the ability to do anything if you can, but at the same time this guilt that you can do so many things just because people of your country are dying. So it was quite difficult and internally sort of overcome. And but maybe you were destined to be one of the voices, because what I see here and is kind of new experience, because during World War II, Nazi German culture was cancelled, and the world was wholly anti-German. While now, um, during the Christmas speech from King Charles, they use Ukrainian carols of the bell. So it sends the message where our support. But at the same time, when Boris Godunov in Royal Opera House, he goes there and he listening to this Russian opera. Or there's in the West End there are theater shows again, and it's such a strong stigma, separation from Putin's regime and there's the great Russian culture, and it's one of the most painful things for me. And I hope just sort of, it somehow change and move Ukrainian voices, and Ukraine won't be interpreted by those from Russia or those who were stationed in Moscow and now they telling story again from Russian perspective. So it's quite a powerful thing. You might not realize it being in Ukraine, but from outside, it's just this is quite big conflict cultural. Pardon.
Well, I pardon.
Don't be too hard on yourself. You might have other destiny.
Well, I don't believe in destiny so much because I think it's our choices that make us. Because my destiny could have been becoming a refugee if I chose that. I'm going abroad like about 3 or 4 times every year. The army lets me out, and I can change my destiny anytime by becoming a deserter, but I never do. So it's not destiny so much. As for culture, I believe it's a similar story to any previously colonized nation. The difference here being that Ukrainians have not been recognized as colonized before because it was not an overseas colonization, but rather something like what Russia did was rather something like, I'm sorry, the United States did with the indigenous populations of the United States, of the America, not just the United States, Canada did as well. So we were not colonized in the sense Africa was, we were rather kind of replaced and mixed in, same as, let's say, the indigenous populations of Latin America were. Yeah, so becoming mestizos and sometimes adopting the language of the colonizer as our own. Many Ukrainians speak Russian, about for the same reason why many Africans speak English or French, or why English is the state language in India. I went to India and I did learn some Hindi for politeness reasons, like to ask what time it is and how do I get to the bus. But mostly I do with English, and same you can do with Russian, of course, in Ukraine. But the reason is the same: it's colonization, nothing else.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I noticed through your interviews and things you were discussing, that you're interested in the psychological aspect of the war. And you emphasized you haven't been in the trenches as yourself, because at the very beginning you were guarding the military, sort of like the locations, the strategic places, and then you were sent to look after POWs, Russians who were caught in captivity. And
Not just Russians, by the way. I want to emphasize that Russians also actually mobilize people from the occupied territories, which is another war crime, by the way, and another reason to send Putin to God if we ever can do that. Because I also met Ukrainian prisoners of war from Mariupol, just occupied just a year before that, already mobilized, and definitely from the Donetsk region in those parts that have been semi-occupied since 2014. Like one of the prisoners of war that I remember best, because I didn't have much to relate to with Russians, it's just like curiosity mostly. But we did talk a lot with a person that's like talking about destiny, right? Who decided not to leave Donetsk after it was occupied in 2014 because he thought that, well, he's an architect, just as I am a writer and a translator. So he thought he would never, nothing would happen to him. And then he was mobilized and into the Russian army after 2022. And he turned up as a wounded prisoner of war in our unit. And whereas Russians would be probably exchanged, a Ukrainian citizen would probably be judged by a court to see if he was forced or if it was a state treason or if it was, I don't know, collaborationism. So this is a very serious thing that is still not talked about a lot. And like once again about prisoners of war, most were Russians, but we also had a mercenary from Nepal, for example, who just wanted to help his mom, and in the end, he will probably spend a lot of time in prison. And luckily, he survived.
many died.
Of course, many people from, and this is something which bothers me, that many people from other colonized countries or previously colonized countries, like people from Africa or people from some Asian countries, they end up in the army of the other empire. You know, they were not colonized by Russia, so they were colonized by, let's say, the British Empire or the French Empire before the 60s. And now they turn up like fighting for another colonizing empire. So this is a very strange paradox and very sad.
What feelings or what emotions did you sort of, probably there were different stages from the very beginning of your duty there with these prisoners of war, people you're supposed to hate, you supposed to feel revenge, some kind. And I'm asking you because I've heard, and it's quite an interesting insight. But before I would like to hear your answer. In summer 2023, I went to Pokrovsk. My cousin,
That's where I was in summer 2023, so we could have met.
Oh, yes, we could. I went to visit my cousin. He's with Special Operations, SSO. And I sort of like, he sneaked me in and I spent a little bit more than 24 hours on the positions. And it wasn't like near the Russians, it was like 20 kilometers or something. And when I came there, the first revelation was I thought, because when you leave abroad and you sort of, I went like 4 times after the full-scale invasion before that trip to the front line, and I thought there's the superhumans there, the cyborgs, that someone unreal, and there's just people.
But
Yesterday,
it was
the real
it was me. It was me.
yes, and
Because
someone you can see.
now you are talking, I am saying I want to say that I also guarded. Well, my unit also guarded all the checkpoints around Pokrovsk. So we might have even crossed each other, but probably it was not my shift, or we just didn't recognize each other. I was very often recognized by other writers, by the way. I was recognized by Lazutkin, who is a great poet. He
I
was at
worked
the
with
time.
him. Dima
Yeah, so
Lazutkin.
he was just passing. He was just passing from another place into Pokrovsk with his unit, and he was like, "Oh, Artem, hello," and I'm like, because for me this is a conveyor of cars that you have to like ask for passwords and read
Yeah,
through.
the password thing.
And so I just didn't get it who he was at first, but then when he said, so yeah, so we might have even crossed our paths,
Yeah,
even though the front line is huge, but we were at the same time and at the same place actually.
how interesting. And the second thing, I was shocked because when I arrived there and I felt like I was so angry with Russians, and I was like, I felt like I'm almost gonna commit the war crimes. And it was so different approach to the guys, the unit where my cousin was commander, and he was saying, no, 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 we are not like them. We are not like them. We just defending, we're humans, because if we start doing that, we turn into animals just like what they do to our people.
Yeah,
And it was
that's what
so
our
sincere.
folks said. Yeah. That's also our folks. Like we had a lieutenant colonel, well, who was actually our commander. And at the very first day, he said, like, okay, if somebody feels he's like very brave to hit any Russian, I can send you to Avdiivka, which was the front line at the time, and you can catch one there and then do anything you want there, right in the trenches. But when you come here, just as a convoying them or guarding them, they're not yours. So treat them as humans. And this was a very important thing for me because at the beginning, when I learned what the unit I was assigned to because it was not my choice. Like so, when I learned what we are supposed to do, I had like nightmares because, of course, I read about the Stanford experiment, the infamous experiment where people just take on the roles of let's say prisoners, bad guards, and I was afraid that this is something that would happen to us. I don't know what was wrong with the Stanford experiment and with the students, but in our case, nothing of the sort happened. And the thing is, yes, you hate Russians from afar. You hate them as a okay, let's say as an occupationist force in general. Yeah, the same way you would I don't know, feel bad feelings maybe about a hurricane or something. But when you see them from up close, these are, to quote Kurt Vonnegut, big unhappy mammals and nothing else, and same as us, by the way. So you see the hurt bodies because most of them become prisoners of war because they were wounded and they could not like get away. Or maybe like not killed, not able to get away, so wounded. So many of them were wounded, and of course, you feel you have to give them at least some painkillers or something like that until they are forwarded to a hospital or wherever. And so, yeah, I kind of tried even to force myself into some disliking, but it was kind of difficult when you're so close. I must say that personally, I felt more dislike for the traitors because you're thinking something like, well, they are Russians. What can you think about them? They were conditioned that way since they were kids. But with the people who were traitors, as I see them, were Ukrainians who then joined the Russian army. Well, Ukrainians meaning from the Donetsk People Republic. I see them as Ukrainians, and this is something that. Yeah, you feel like, yeah, these are not good people. Well, Russians, of course, you don't feel that the Russian soldiers are very good people, but you like they're unlucky to have been born there. We all, by the way, this is something that foreigners maybe don't understand. We have to clarify that most Ukrainians have some relatives that maybe emigrated to Russia as immigrant workers in the 90s, and they became basically Russians politically. So I myself have a relative who emigrated to Russia as a teenager, and basically he's a Russian citizen and he supports Putin. And this is a very sad thing. This is something to realize that it's not about ethnicity or something. This is about brainwashing.
I'll tell you the story about traitors from south of London. So,
What?
south of London, it's the traitor story. So, the Ukrainian mother um, goes to the parents' evening at school, And it's like new class, new school, new everyone, and she just sit next to a woman, just ordinary woman, and the teacher approaches to meet them, to greet, and blah blah blah. And this lady sitting next to her is like, "Oh, we're Russians. We're learning Russian. We're Russian." And it's all happening like within like, I don't know, a year or two ago. So the full-scale invasion, Putin is evil, blah blah blah. And as you can imagine, the shock of the Ukrainian mom. And she returns and she talks to her child and saying, "Did you realize there's actually Russians? Oh, but this girl is nice. Yes, but she's nice. And how can you explain? Because your child never been in Ukraine and or been in Ukraine. So basically it's not like those children who escaped from the bombs and missiles who doesn't need explanation. And then it goes further, and it's turning out that this lady we are Russians and we learn in Russians, she's actually from the village, which is not from the village of this Ukrainian mom. They just so pro Putin, and Putin is cool, their child says, and all of those things. And this is London. And
Yeah.
this interesting thing. So, when you look at the writers, I mean, through the history, who write about the war, and I know you don't agree with some, but how what's your revelation after you've been writing at the war and comparing what you read about the war through the classics and foreign authors?
I think you just start reevaluating them, but I think it's important to read them through a new lens. Like, for example, when I tried rereading Remark, Nothing New on the Western Front, what I noticed was that the German soldier, Paul Boehmer, right, is actually in France and he doesn't even think about it. Or when you read the the German author, he just slipped my mind, who wrote Im Stahlgewitter, so in the steel thunderstorms, if I'm translating it right. So in German, it's Im Stahlgewitter. So he is also like talking about, oh, there's such a friendly civilian French population around us, but he's a German soldier, and he doesn't even notice that something may be off here. And similarly, like when I now reread Hemingway, The Farewell to Arms, so what I see is the story of a foreigner who came to fight on the side of Italians, and then he just deserted because he could, because it was not his war, because he was just, well, the protagonist, I'm not saying about Hemingway himself, but the protagonist just escaped because he could, because he didn't have Italian family members behind him to kind of try to protect. So this is a very difficult story, different story from ours. Unfortunately, we're still lacking good stories about the war of the people who don't have another choice, you know. So of course, World War I ended up in total disillusionment, but World War II was not like that, for example. So for me, one of the things that I did value more than before was the dark comedy Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Which is more relevant to us in the sense that the protagonist, Yossarian, says that, of course, our country must defeat Hitler, and of course, Hitler will be defeated, but why me? So this is something which is more of a question for Ukrainian soldiers. So, of course, we have to fight off the Russian invasion, otherwise there will be no Ukraine, otherwise we will all either become refugees or worse, will be occupied and tortured, by the way. This is something that maybe foreigners don't imagine, how much this forces you to keep fighting, that it's better to die dying than be tortured by the KGB or the Russian occupationist administration. And so for us, this is something where the main question is rather why I am fighting for years and years on, and I can see that other people are not. So this is something more relevant than Hemingway on a remark for us, where the cause is clear and the main question is rather how it's not always justly and fairly distributed. The burden is always mostly on the shoulders of the unprivileged. Like even people like myself, I was never very rich, but I'm privileged by my status, and I can always like escape. For example, like many intelligentsia, like I could join, I don't know, a PhD program, for example, or something like that. Whereas all of the burden is, as always, as in most wars, on the shoulders of these construction workers, of, I don't know, supermarket bouncers, and people like that.
Boys from the village. Uh,
Boys from the village, boys from the city, because 75% of Ukrainians live in cities and towns. Well, Ukraine is a very industrialized, well, not industrialized, but urbanized nation recently. But still, yeah, you can see the difference between people who are, well, like white collars and blue collars. So in American terms, mostly the burden of the war is on the blue collar workers.
so seeing war of different stages, and do you think good Russian exist? And if they exist, where they are?
Oh, they are in the armed forces of Ukraine, for example. This is something also that we have to talk about, that there are many Russian citizens who actually joined the armed forces of Ukraine. Some of them have their own agenda. Like, for example, well, I don't want to trash any unit, but let's say there's like right-wing Russians who just want to fight against Putin. But there's also separate individuals who see the injustice and they feel the guilt and they join. This is very difficult for them because they have to pass through security checks that they are not like spies or something. But they do join Russian citizens, Belarusian citizens. There are a lot of Belarusian citizens. As for Russian citizens, we must say that that's the Russian nationality and the Russian citizenship. There's a lot of Chechens, and you understand why people from Chechnya would be fighting against Russia, because Chechnya was almost destroyed by Russia, and then like a Chechen trader was put into place to be a Putin like colonial, I don't know, representative. And so yeah, good Russians exist. There's also the good Russians who try to disrupt the Russian military logistics inside Russia itself. There's the good Russians who, I don't know, try to burn the Russian military stations. There's these cases, but they're very ruthlessly repressed, of course, because these are like individuals. It's very difficult to create a guerrilla organization or an underground now, whereas there's so much well, internet, I don't know, video cameras and stuff like that. It's not like when Che Guevara was fighting, you know, or Fidel Castro was fighting. It's very different. We live in a very different time. But yes, the good Russians do exist. The one thing that, since we're talking to Western audiences, is never to try to like marry Ukrainians and what you perceive as good Russians against our will, because I was in a situation like that. I was uh, at a well, whatever, at a festival in America where the good willing Americans were trying to make us talk together with the Russian opposition. And neither Russian opposition wanted it, nor us. But the American liberals thought this is a good thing, you know, we will be the peace dealers. This doesn't work because we have a lot of suspicion to Russian opposition, because we very often see the Russian opposition as organization, as another, maybe often imperialist project. And like personally, I admire Navalny's personal courage of coming back. But we Ukrainians all remember that Navalny was within this Russian consensus on the Crimea when Putin conquered Crimea, which was how the war started, even though some people maybe don't realize it. Navalny actually said that no, we will not give Crimea back. It's not a sandwich to be passed back and forth. And so in Ukraine, Navalny had the nickname of Sandwich because of that. So this is like just one thing why Ukrainians do, well, not necessarily mistrust by but are very suspicious about any Russian position, because very often they just want to, well, they have their own agenda. And I personally don't mind that the Europeans or the Westerners work with them, because they hope that they will change the Putin regime to something maybe better. But we Ukrainians are very suspicious about all of that, because you cannot, well, even, well, any, well, not any, but most Russian opposition are still like contaminated by the imperialist thinking. I had a very good, well, not a friend, but someone I tried to learn from. Well, let's put it like with names. Like I used to respect Sergei Maximishin, who is one of the greatest Russian photographers. But it turned out that he thinks that he's like anti-Putin and he emigrated. Yes, so he's the Russian opposition for me. But he also thinks that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a bad idea, that great culture does not exist, to quote him, where he quotes Putin, I think, does not exist in the world of Slovakias and Slovenias. And this is such haughtiness. So, and for us Ukrainians, this is something that is associated with Russian opposition. And when sometimes when they say, "What? But this one is not good. This one is bad," and there's a good sorry, there's a good Ukrainian saying about all this Russian opposition, that I don't want to get too much into different sorts of shit. I'm sorry about this word. So of course it always looks different, but you don't want to analyze it with a microscope. So this is why we don't just deal with them, even though I may personally respect some of the persons, but I may be mistaken about who to respect, you know? And so collectively, we're mistrustful.
Interesting thing happened recently. Ukrainian author Artur Hrun, is it correct surname?
To drone.
Yeah, he refused to be published in Norway, and it's the biggest publisher just because last year they released a book based on the story of Wagner fighter, and it was bestseller. And for them, it's just the way how they reflect on the Russian-Ukrainian war. So, what do you think about those kind of moments?
It's always very difficult, and this is always a personal choice, you know, of the author. Because I was thinking about what I would do. I don't know. Uh, like this also means I have to dig very deeply into like every publisher, let's say. And if, well, in Germany, I'm published by Penguin. I cannot like, I don't know what else they publish, and obviously they publish a lot of very different things. Yeah. So, and that's also like one of the biggest publishers. So it's very complicated for everyone. I respect Dron. I respect Dron's decision, and I respect him as a person a lot, by the way. He's a very talented young Ukrainian author.
But at the same time, it feels like I fully understand him. And
Yeah,
but at the same time, I wish there were more voices from Ukraine, different, because the truth is there are so many journalists who are looking for good Russians. They are just desperate, and for them to show Russian side of the war is just to be being objective or doing their job. They just, it feels like they normalize their violence, those war crimes, and everything what Russia does, and sort of. On one hand, they normalize their violence and what they do in Ukraine. On the other hand, they sort of calling for pity and feeling sorry for them. But and apparently there's a trend with the soldiers who were 4 or 3 years at war, and now they're trying to get visa to Germany or any other countries, and they're happy to talk to BBC or other outlets and tell about their hardships and challenges, which makes me so angry, because you can't. Where's the sentiments of Boko Haram fighters? Why we don't reflect on those pain? Why why we can sort of compare it?
Yeah, I agree. To be honest, I don't follow, but I agree with what you say. I try not to follow too much all of these things. Like I can understand the curiosity of it's a similar curiosity to why Hannibal Lecter is such an interesting character, from The Silence of the Lambs. But yeah, you can. That's curious. That's curious.
Did you have a moment since you joined the army that sort of, let's call it, no return point, or this is where sort of my writer's identity, I feel like I'm losing it and I'm more of a soldier, a defender, or somehow you managed sort of.
No, not at all. Not at all. In Ukraine, there's a lot. Well, in Ukrainian, my book is called "Not Born for War." Because there was this joke in the beginning that some people are, well, not joke, but sarcasm, that some people are not born for war, and that's why they don't join the resistance. Nobody's born for war. So I feel there's another kind of sarcastic joke in Ukraine that when some person called it, well, my husband is a deeply civilian person. Well, I feel a deeply civilian person still. Like I still hate everything related to the army. By the way, after 4 years in the army, I'm still like private first rank, which is the lowest after the private, and I don't aim to do anything about it. And the only thing I'm waiting for or hoping for is to be let out into the civilian life again. So I don't feel that maybe I actively resist having this soldier mind. Of course, I have a diagnosed, like, not PTSD, but it's called, what is it called? In Ukrainian, it's rozlad adaptacji, so adaptation disorder or misadaptation disorder, well, which is treated by antidepressants and talking therapy. So this happened, but I still disrespect and dislike hierarchies, for example. So much of the things that I do in the army is maybe my own, initiative, which is frowned upon in the army. But this is what this is what we are. We are civilians who are forced to fight, unfortunately.
You have two boys, and quite often in the interviews, you're saying, I'm fighting for my boys not to have to do this in the future. And in Ukraine, quite often, you can hear in the media or in private conversations that many joined the army because they were thinking about the situation when their children's going to ask what you were doing when the Ukraine was in this the hardest time, historical times. Do you have the moment of relief or any sort of positive feeling when you sort of your boys are going to be proud of you? And you didn't just join the war, you also remain in the public figure. And quite often you talk about difficult questions. And you were the first one probably who said that, look, I've been in the war as long as I can, so let's make it legislation and other can come so I can be again father and husband. Or you were, I think, sort of maybe the first one who was saying that we're going through in society transformation where we can divide and be in the bad ones who escaped and spend those years with the family, and the good ones and very unhappy who actually been at the war and were fighting and they were sort of having lots of credit publicly. So that feeling that you joined the fight, that you prioritized Ukraine and you did what honorable man would do, does it make you feel good? Or
Uh, we were talking before about the guilt, like you were mentioning it, and I must say that, like, even being in the army, you still have this a level of guilt, another level of guilt, because yes, I missed 2 years of family life. And for that, I feel guilty, not so much before the boys, but before my wife, because this is something that needs to be mentioned too, that whenever a soldier or a family member goes and joins the army, the other family member, and mostly it's like the woman, remains with the kids, becoming, let's put it this way, forced single mother, right? And so my wife aged a lot, like with all the stress, being a refugee with 2 children and a dog, and having to find schools, having to for both of them, because in Germany it was like different schools for different ages, not even the same one, and having to take care of the dog too, and having to have a job, and having to find an apartment. And you imagine how it was, like she tried to find an apartment in Berlin, if that says anything to you, which is one of the most nightmarish cities to find an apartment in. She failed, so she had to move to another city. And all of this because I joined the army. So this is one level of guilt. On the other hand, after 2 years in the army, I mean, after 2 years, more or less, like near the front line, I was able to get transferred to an office job in the army, which is where I am now. And I have a level of guilt, like before those unprivileged, like my pobratimy or comrades in arms, who are still far away from their families. And what to say about those people who died already? And yes, I was the first person, I think, to publicly, using my publicity, start talking about the need for rotation between civilians and people in the military who are also civilians, but in the military. But my position is changing and oscillating on that thing, because I realize that we don't have enough resources for that, unfortunately. So the only thing the government is able to do now is just to barely get enough people to replace the wounded, the killed, maybe the people who did desert. And I can see how a rotation system is possible now, considering that the Russian population is, what, 5 times bigger? And considering, by the way, we're talking about prisoners of war. So most of the prisoners of war I saw, which maybe not representatives, were from the so-called prison population. Because Russia has an even bigger, well, please fact check me, but I think Russia has an even bigger per capita prison population than the United States. Only in Russia, it's not a race system, but more of a class system. So the underclass, what in Germany, in German may be called Lumpenproletariat, so not even the proletarians, but like the underproletarians, are mostly the prisoner population. And very often they're given a choice of 1 year in the army, and then you get out, and if lucky, getting interviewed by BBC or Deutsche Welle, or getting published by the Norwegian publisher, or staying in prison for 20 years and dying of tuberculosis, for example. And of course, so here we are unequal. And I don't know if Ukraine, like logistically or physically, can replace all these people. It takes a lot of, considering that the longer it goes on, I think the chance is lost. It had to be made like in the first half a year to, like make the system of like 2 years versus 2 years. And then also, I think that many people who would get out of the army, like obviously would not get into the army again. Many wouldn't. And so now we're in now where we are.
I ask I ask all my guests this question: why do you love Ukraine? But before we get there, I'm just telling you in advance, because this kind of answer sometimes requires a little bit of thinking or thought or something, because it's not something on the surface. It's not what we think in everyday life. For those people who are far away and think, well, it's war somewhere there, what would you like for them to understand what's happening in Ukraine? And the other sort of part of the question, what do you think the most misinformed about Russian war in Ukraine for those people who are in the UK, Australia, Canada, US?
Yeah, actually, I will start with the thing which is the easiest for me, as you put it, like why I love Ukraine. I have tried living abroad several times long before the war. My first book was about my travels in Latin America, which were largely influenced by Jack Kerouac's On the Road. But I was even poorer than the protagonist of Kerouac. I was actually living not in hotels, not with friends, but like on the sides of the roads in tents, hitchhiking because I didn't have enough money for buses or anything. And I fell in love with Mexico. So when I got married with my wife, uh, I'm once married, so since I was a teenager almost. And when we got married, I tried to get her to live in Mexico. We lived in Mexico, which I loved, which is my favorite country in the world, um, foreign country in the world. So we tried living there, and we realized how lonely we were getting, even in this country of my dreams, and how different, for example, the situation was for my wife in such a machista country. So we turned back. Then again, we tried other countries, and every time we realized that it may sound romantic, but it's not very nice living abroad, even as voluntary migrants. When my wife became a refugee in Germany, it was like, and she has a PhD and she had a job at a university. It's not like she changed her line of work. And still, like being a refugee is a very bad situation. So if you are dealing with any refugees or immigrants in your country, so please, this is a very hard decision. So maybe this is like, especially for Trump voters, this is not done because of good life. And so for me, Ukraine was something that I physically loved. I wanted to come back all the time, however much I traveled. Um, and lately, like in the most recent years, since the invasion, I started walking, literally like walking all over Ukraine. I went like every time I got a chance, like any weekend, not any because I have kids, but like very often, like when there's vacations and the kids are at the grandparents, I just literally like went to some random point and started walking for like dozens or maybe hundreds of kilometers, hiking basically. So for me, this is a very physical love. And in 2022 was exactly 300 years of birth of the most famous Ukrainian philosopher. We are a country which has a philosopher on our money. And he was famous not so much for his thoughts as for his life, because he was like a philosopher in life. And he ended up his life traveling, walking the country. And so I decided that this year, 2022, as soon as spring comes, I will go and start with the place of his death and like walk back, backwards from like through the place of his birth and on in Ukraine. But spring never came because Russia attacked on the 24th of February 2022, just before I wanted to go for this walk. So for me, this is why I love Ukraine. Like it's a very intimate and physical feeling because I walked hundreds of kilometers with my own feet, and I wrote books about that and books about like fiction about protagonists who do something similar. So this is the easiest question. As for other parts, I think it's more difficult for me to answer. I don't know the foreign audiences enough to understand what the people are most misinformed about. I think some people are misinformed about where. Oh, I can tell rather about what triggered me. I think not many people, but some people, especially like in the far left, on the far right, were saying that Ukraine is acting as an American proxy. So what now? I wonder what these people think now when Trump is forcing Ukraine into surrender. Putin is like basically on the same time as Trump, but actively. So whose proxy are we now? I don't know. So you can think about somebody else, maybe where the proxies are, I don't know, who Poland, because we are protecting Poland with our bodies, because Poland was once occupied by the Russian Empire, or By the way, I want to thank very much Poland because despite what their nation, what there's some hysteria, like anti-Ukrainian hysteria in Poland now, probably because there's too many immigrants, and the immigrants are statistically uh, less unemployed than the Poles. This is a very strange situation because the immigrants are the ones who are active. Well, the ones who emigrated from Ukraine were not like the elderly or the alcoholics, but like the economically active people who were like searching for a better life, mostly women searching for a better life for their kids or a safer life for their kids. And I want to thank other people who I think we are also defending, but we feel a lot of support. It's like the Baltic countries, the countries around the Baltic Sea that were also occupied by the Soviet Empire after World War II, after having been independent for some time
Yeah.
from Russian Empire, by the way. And so these are the people that we're also defending with our bodies. And I think this is like to answer your third question, this is something that people have to understand that willingly, not willingly, but Ukrainians are also defending some of the other. Well, I don't think like Ukrainians are defending Great Britain. That's too far. But some of the neighbors and some of the previously occupied countries by the Russian Empire and then the Soviets are also the one that we are actually protecting. And the most weird thing is the position of the Hungarian government, because Hungary was occupied, and I lived in Budapest for a year. That's another country where we tried to kind of emigrate, well, to live for some time. And there's still they left deliberately all the shells from the Russian tanks from the occupation of 1956, which was already like, well, allegedly the Soviet Union was not Stalinist anymore, but they still did occupy the government, the country which decided to turn against the, well, turn a little bit away from the socialist bloc. So this is a weird thing, of course. Same as with Slovakia, by the way, that the people are okay, but the government, like, it's weird because Czechoslovakia was also occupied by the Soviets in 1968, and luckily these are the exceptions, but mostly people I think do understand that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you write. And thank you for the discussions you're starting about Ukraine and inside Ukraine. And everyone who wants to carry on diving in your world, I will leave all the links to Amazon with all your books. And you do lots of English interviews. I've seen Kiev Post. So you keep
Yeah, I was even on
checking.
CNN several times.
So
Yeah, so
that's
of course.
thank you for you doing it and finding the energy, the time, and spirit, because it requires a lot of, isn't it? And yeah, and take care.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and I want to thank everybody who's watching us for the support. Thank you.
There was honest and deep conversation with Ukrainian writer Artem Chapeye. Now he's a soldier with Ukrainian armed forces. And interviews like this just remind us there's war and there's real people with own tragedy, challenges, and achievements. And those achievements you can read yourself. I leave the links under this video so you can go and order book and read more about Artem, and maybe there will be some thought-provoking ideas or anything, or at least it will widen your horizons about Ukraine. Thank you for watching. If you find this conversation interesting, please hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. It means a lot to me, and YouTube will see this. It will be good for the podcast. Thank you, and take care.